Hey, well met, travelers. Thanks for stopping by my channel. I really appreciate it a lot. My name is Bob of the Old Ways. If you're new here, welcome. If you're not new here, welcome back. Today, you should be seeing the thumbnail on screen right now. Today, I'm going to be reacting to a video called The Problem with Rings of Power. Yes, it's that reliable genre of YouTube content that's guaranteed to get clicks, where somebody who's a very bad, no good Tolkien explainer decides to tell us why the Rings of Power sucks. Now, if you're not familiar with my channel prior to watching this content, you should know that I am a lifelong J.R.R. Tolkien fan who has read and reread The Lord of the Rings more times than I have read any other book, including the Bible, in my entire life. And I've read the Silmarillion, the Unfinished Tales, his letters, etc., etc., etc. And I love the Rings of Power. I love it so much that I basically devoted my entire channel to defending it for the last year and a half or so. So I'm very used to these goofy arguments by people who put on the pretense of understanding either, as we're going to see in this video, I think, either Tolkien's theological beliefs or Tolkien's writing skills or whatever. They pretend they know it better than the people who made the Rings of Power. And typically, in their criticisms, they reveal that they actually know far less than they are pretending to. So the guy I'm looking at today is named Paulo Fabregas, and I hope I'm pronouncing that name correctly. If not, my apologies to him. It's nothing personal. But his video, again, is titled The Problem with Rings of Power, and the thumbnail shows us wrong theology, wrong world, and has a picture of Galadriel from the Peter Jackson trilogy next to a picture of Galadriel from the Rings of Power, which is already a tell, at least a potential tell, because one of the things it means is that very likely what we are about to see is someone whose first exposure or primary exposure to The Lord of the Rings was the Peter Jackson films. And very possibly, he is projecting the implicit theology and the implicit moral values and the implicit worldview of the Peter Jackson films backwards into the text of The Lord of the Rings, rather than drawing themes, rather than doing what the Rings of Power does, which is to draw themes directly out of Tolkien and put them on screen in a way different than Peter Jackson did. Peter Jackson also drew themes out of Tolkien's work, very obviously so. I mean, he had adapted The Lord of the Rings, for God's sake. But he decided to focus on different themes and framed things in different ways than the Rings of Power does. Not better, just different. And also emphasized different themes and different framing than Tolkien himself did. So perhaps all of those differences will be highlighted in this bit of commentary from Paulo Fabregas. I've talked about them extensively here on my channel. You can go check out my other content for that. But without further ado, let's get into The Problem with Rings of Power by Paulo Fabregas. Okay? So I'm going to try to do this in as good faith as possible. And we'll just see where it goes.
Why the Rings of Power does not feel like Tolkien.
Yes, it does.
There are two
to
reasons.
me, anyway.
One is theology, and the second is
Okay.
cohesion. Hi, I'm Paulo Fabregas. Back to the video. So the first one is theology, right? Why doesn't Rings of Power feel like Tolkien? The first one is theology. Tolkien, as you all know, it was a Catholic, and he has stated that The Lord of the Rings is an undeniably Catholic work. And there is a huge gap between how The Rings of Power and The Lord of the Rings view evil, and why one show has orcs suing for peace for their wives and babies, and the original does not. What is evil, and what should our
Okay, let me stop you right there, bud. No, there is not a huge difference. In fact, the Rings of Power is more Christian than the Lord of the Rings movies by Peter Jackson. I've talked about this extensively. I made a whole video about the way that Rings of Power engages with Tolkien's Christian themes and specifically with his Catholic themes. And one of the biggest ones that maybe Paolo will mention it, I don't know. But one of the biggest things that the Rings of Power does that is rooted in Tolkien's Catholic worldview is it has a consistent theme running through it, both in dialogue, visuals, plot construction, framing, and so forth, even the pacing of divine providence at work in the world. You can see in the video I made on the way that Rings of Power engages with Tolkien's Christian themes, I did a little montage in there showing several different characters expressing through their dialogue the idea that God, or Eru Iluvatar, who they haven't really said that name in the show, but there are divine forces at work, and they are moving things and pushing characters to do things. And the characters in the show are noticing the show, right? Like, one of the criticisms made of the show when it first launched is that it often felt plot-driven rather than character-driven, and that was on purpose. That was to further the theme that divine providence is unfolding in the world of Middle-earth. And several characters, particularly Galadriel, noticed that and spoke of it explicitly multiple times in the narrative. So I don't know where you get the idea that the theology is wrong in the Rings of Power. As for the Orcs, which Paolo has just mentioned, you know what? Let's see what he says first. I don't want to operate I want to operate in good faith. So let's see what he actually says.
Our relationship be with evil. In The Lord of the Rings, the primary evil is the ring itself, a powerful, magical tool that is wholly evil. Anybody who tries to use it to do good and destroy Sauron will become another Sauron himself. Gandalf is tempted by it and resists it. Galadriel is tempted by it, and we have this amazing scene. Instead of a Dark Lord, you shall have a queen. This is Catholic.
Okay, well, we'll get to that comment on the screen in a minute. But that scene in the Lord of the Rings movie, you shall have a queen instead of a Dark Lord, all shall love me in despair. That moment, okay? That moment of Galadriel, like, demonstrating what her actual weakness is, the ring was offering her what she most wanted. That moment didn't come out of nowhere, okay? And that moment, that revelation, it's in the book too, and though it's expressed differently, that revelation that Galadriel has ambitions to political power in Middle-earth. That's, if you read the Silmarillion, that's part of the reason that she came to Middle-earth in the first place, to establish and rule a realm of her own. Like, that is the seed on which the Galadriel of Rings of Power is built. And if you can't see that, you don't understand either Tolkien's written word or the Rings of Power or the Peter Jackson films. You just don't. You're just spitting gas here, right? So we'll come back to the Orcs. I'm sure he's going to come back to the Orcs. But he's about to, I think, make a fundamental mistake about the way the Rings of Power views the nature of evil. So let's see what he has to say here.
Catholic theology. You cannot commit an evil act to do good. You cannot murder because a person might do something evil, even if you think he's going to throttle you in your sleep. This is the conflict of Sam and Frodo with Gollum. In the real world, you cannot drop an atomic bomb on a civilian population because you think it's going to save lives.
Okay, yeah, I agree with that.
And in The Lord of the Rings, even desiring to use the ring drives people mad, even if it's to do good. Boromir loses his mind as he attacks Frodo. Saruman becomes a twisted shell of himself enslaved to Sauron and the ring. Denethor loses all hope because his hope lied solely on the use of the ring. The ring has a greater effect on the great, and the less are surprisingly resistant to its terrible effects, which is why hobbits can hold it for so long.
Okay, so far, I'm on board. He's correct. This is the worldview of Tolkien and his Catholicism, and it is the way it's expressed in the text of The Lord of the Rings. Not so much the movie, The Lord of the Rings, but yes, so far he's on point. So I'll give him credit for that, because this is an understanding of Catholic theology and moral teachings that a lot of other pundits on YouTube fundamentally misunderstand when they talk about the Rings of Power and the Peter Jackson films. Like, one thing they do, I've mentioned before, is they begin with Peter Jackson's film and they read the framing of morality in that film backwards into the text of The Lord of the Rings. And Paolo is not doing that here, so I want to give him credit for that.
But they too can become twisted, broken wretches if the ring is held too long. And 3 elven rings, though made for good, since they are made with the same magic as the One Ring, are bound to it. Though they desire to do good with it and preserve the beauty of Middle-earth, they cannot because of their connection to the One. What an incredible temptation and horrible problem the ring creates. If the ring finds its way into Sauron's hand, he covers the land in darkness. If you use the ring, you will certainly defeat Sauron, but you in turn will become a second Sauron and cover the land in darkness. And even the desire...
Okay, put a pin in that. If the ring comes into the hands of Sauron, he will cover the land in darkness, right? That is the conflict of The Lord of the Rings. Important to understand that The Lord of the Rings, the novel that Tolkien wrote, takes place in the Third Age. It is in many ways a post-apocalyptic story. And the reason the world is in a post-apocalyptic state is because the One Ring was once in the possession of Sauron, and he did cover the land with darkness. Now, that's what's happening in the Rings of Power. The Rings of Power is going to get increasingly darker in tone, something that a lot of the pundits are complaining about, by the way, because Sauron is going to create the One Ring and cover the land in darkness. That is what the whole backstory of Lord of the Rings is about. And what we're seeing in Rings of Power is playing through the events of the Second Age. We've just seen the fall of Eregion. It looks like Season 3 is going to focus on the War of the Elves and Sauron. We're going to see the fall of Numenor. We're going to see possibly a version of the fall of Khazad-dûm, although in the books that came in the Third Age, really. We're going to see the War of the Last Alliance, because Sauron, up until the War of the Last Alliance, is going to win. So just keep that in mind whenever you see people complaining about the Rings of Power, like supposedly ruining Tolkien by putting evil at the front of the narrative and by having everyone in the story become more and more morally depraved, because that is the whole point. That is why Sauron is bad. Okay? Just keep that in mind.
Desire to use it already drives you mad. You cannot commit an evil act to do good. This is Catholic theology. Point number 2, the original is cohesive. A great story is always about one thing. The Lord of the Rings is a work of Catholic evangelization and is about God's triumph over sin and evil.
Mm-hmm.
You feel the presence of God, or Iluvatar, through...
Ooh, he used the name.
He is the force that guides the ring into Bilbo's
yes,
hand and
yes.
leads it into Frodo's. And in the end, Frodo doesn't save the day. God does.
Correct.
Gollum slips and the ring falls in the fires of Mount Doom.
Okay, I made this exact point in my video about the way that Rings of Power engages with Tolkien's Christian themes. I pointed out this difference, and I'm glad Paolo did too, because one of the things one of the criticisms I've addressed, I also addressed this in my video about where I respond to Disparu. The less said about him, the better. But one of the points he made in his argument is that the Rings of Power rejects the masculine Christian values of the Lord of the Rings. And he claims that if you remove the Catholic theology and the Christian moral worldview from the narrative, then the rest of it will fall apart. And that's why, according to him, the Rings of Power is a failure. And it looks like Paolo is about to try and make the same point. He's going to claim that the Rings of Power is not engaging with Tolkien's Christian themes. And an important difference between the Peter Jackson films and the books is that in the films, Frodo has a lot more agency in the destruction of the One Ring than he has in the book. And that undermines Tolkien's Catholic worldview, because the entire point of the way it unfolds in the book, which is where Frodo fails and Gollum slips and falls into the lava, that is the point of that story, is that is God using one of the most depraved and lowly creatures in the world as the instrument of his justice, right? And the movie takes that agency away from Eru Ilúvatar and puts it in the hands of Frodo, which fundamentally undermines the Catholic worldview that is supposedly baked into the Lord of the Rings so deeply that removing it will cause the entire narrative to fail and make it an abomination. So far, Paolo's summary of Tolkien's worldview and the way it's being unfolded in the book version of the Lord of the Rings is spot on. He mentioned orcs a moment ago, and I'm going to come back to that. I'm giving him a chance to maybe get back to that point. But I think he's about to claim that the Rings of Power TV show has removed the Christian themes of the Rings of Power, when I would argue it has more Christianity in it than Peter Jackson's films did.
We do not save ourselves. That's Catholic theology. And everybody in the book struggles against this one thing, this one doom, the temptation to use evil for good. But only God can save us, and God is good. It's one story, cohesive.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Now to the Rings of Power episode.
Here we go.
Is the theology correct? Is it cohesive? No.
Yes.
And no.
Yes.
I've only watched one episode of the Rings of Power.
Okay. There we go.
That it lacks the cohesion.
Right. It doesn't matter what you say, Paolo. You just gave up the whole game right here. You watched one episode. One. Okay? Presumably the pilot episode. Okay? You cannot, it is simply impossible for you to determine whether the theology matches or not, or any other aspect of the show matches Tolkien's vision or not, by watching one episode. It is impossible to do that. It is incredibly bad faith of you to do that. And I have to say, I am not surprised by this. Everything you say after this is bullshit. This is the laziest, most bad faith way to engage with the show that exists. The only thing that's more bad faith is not watching the show at all and just repeating talking points from like The Critical Drinker, Nerdrotic, Disparu, Shadiversity, and all those other pack-leds over at Friday Night Spite, right? You just gave up the game, Paolo. Nothing you say after this holds any water. But let's hear what you have to say.
Vision and moral compass of Tolkien. You can say, oh, but that's just one episode, Paolo. Give it time. No.
Yes.
From the onset, you should establish your major theme. If Breaking Bad can do it in the opening episode, so can you. What is Galadriel's arc about? What are the clues set up by the writers? Galadriel is obsessed with evil, that the pursuit of evil is what she is. She is nothing without her sword. In short, she needs evil to exist in order to be. She's so compelled to fight the evil,
What?
she would rather cross the sundering seas by swimming
Okay.
than go to Valinor, elf heaven. But the writers didn't really even establish elf heaven as a nice place anyway. It's a place where evil elf boys destroy your beautifully made paper boats.
One word, Paolo, one name for you. Feanor. Or Feanor, however you want to say it. Elf heaven? I think you're a little confused about Valinor. Go read the Silmarillion, bro. The elves were messy, even in Valinor. It's perfectly consistent with what Tolkien wrote.
Who would want to go there? So in Galadriel, we have the question of what does it mean to be good if evil does not exist? In order for me to be good, I need the evil. See how this departs from Catholic and Tolkienian.
Dude, this is not... You are getting this so fucking wrong. Oh my... Oh. I cannot believe... Oh. This is so bad. That is not... I know exactly what he's going to say. I know exactly what he's going to say. Here's what he's going to lead up to. I have not pre-watched this. Okay. Here's what he's going to say. He's about to tell you, at some point in this video, he's going to say that the theme of Galadriel's arc is the line that appears at the end of the episode where her brother leans down, Finrod leans down and says, sometimes you have to touch the darkness to understand the light, or words to that effect. I don't remember the exact words. He's going to say that is the theme of Galadriel's arc, and it objectively is not. We'll get to that, I'm sure. Let's see if he goes there, though.
Theology. Iluvatar exists even before evil comes into the world. He is good. He creates good things with freedom. Morgoth used that freedom to oppose Iluvatar, and evil enters the world because anything that goes against what Iluvatar wants is evil. But in the Lord of the Rings of Power, it's hard to tell what is good and what is evil.
Not really, no.
This is underlined by the episode in this exchange between Finrod and Galadriel. I will now play.
I knew it. I knew he was going to go here. Okay. All I will say right now is ask Paolo, what was the very first line of dialogue? It was narration. The very first line, the very first thing we hear anyone say in the Rings of Power. The line was, nothing is evil in the beginning. Just remember that. Let's see where Paolo... I knew he was going to do this, but let's see what his argument actually is.
Both parts with my English accent. Finrod. With her friends, Galadriel plays with a paper ship. It was a good ship, sister. I made it just as you taught me. Do you know why a ship floats and a stone cannot? Because the stone sees only downward. The darkness of the water is vast and irresistible. The ship feels the darkness as well, striving moment by moment to master her and pull her under. But the ship has a secret, for unlike the stone, her gaze is not downward but up, fixed upon the light that guides her, whispering of grander things than darkness ever knew. But sometimes the light shines just as brightly reflected in the water as they do in the sky. It's hard to say which way is up and which way is down. How am I to know which lights to follow? Then he whispers in her ear, and this is mystery boxed until the very end, until finally it's revealed what he says. Sometimes we cannot know until we have touched the darkness. But that seems so simple. The most important truths often are, but you must learn to discern them for yourself. I won't always be here to speak them to you. I must touch darkness in order to know the true light. I must be intimate with evil in order to know what is good.
Wrong. that was just the expression of the biblical principle that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We are all touched by darkness. That's it. That's all that meant. Okay. I'll hold my tongue. Let's see what he says. I think I know where he's going with this, but we'll see.
This is not Catholic theology. In fact, I'd say that it's kind of Marxist, right? Good and evil aren't values that we know from the beginning.
What?
Given to us by God himself. No. Good and...
What? Wait, what? Okay.
Evil are values that we discover ourselves by experimenting and prodding and feeling the limits. This comes from the idea that we are...
Tell me you haven't read Marx without saying you haven't read Marx. Where did this... I know where this comes from historically, but like, where do folks like this get the idea that everything that disagrees with their particular interpretation of a particular kind of Christianity is Marxist? What does the word Marxism mean to you, sir? I really need you to explain that.
Ourselves define what is good and what is evil, and God does not. People also say that this is an example of good writing, but it is not. So let's explore this metaphor about the lights. Galadriel doesn't know which is the true...
All right, before he goes on, I will concede that the analogy Finrod makes in that scene is pretty clunky. I cringed a little bit when I heard it. I got the point they were trying to make, but it wasn't the best analogy in the world. I will grant you that. And it has led to an unnecessary amount of confusion.
Light, the reflection, or the sun. So let's put ourselves in Galadriel's position. You're standing by a pool, you see a reflected light, you see the sun. Oh, which one is the true light? I'm confused. The one in the sky. My head, feet, gravity tell me which is the true light.
You think I should point out that this scene in Rings of Power takes place before the existence of the sun? I know it may be nitpicking a little bit, because the point of because the moral and theological principle behind this scene is that we are all blinded by sin sometimes, and we've all fallen short of the glory of God, etc. But in the chronology of The Lord of the Rings, the scene he's talking about takes place before the existence of the sun. The only light here at this time comes from the two trees, Telperion and Laurelin. I'm forgetting their exact names. One was shed a golden light, one shed the silver light. And it was only after Morgoth and Ungoliant destroyed them, and after that happened, and after the creation of the Silmarils and all that craziness happened, only then did the sun and the moon exist. So his critique of the logistics of this analogy just breaks down when you pay attention to the chronology of Tolkien's world.
So if Galadriel came up to me and told me that, I'd tell her, what do you mean you can't tell? You can't tell what's up or down? This is a lousy metaphor. So in order to know that Sauron is evil, I must touch Sauron. But you see now how that flies in the face of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Saruman's desire to be intimate with the ring is what corrupts him. Same with Boromir and Denethor. These people are opposed to characters like Faramir, who wouldn't pick up the ring even if they found it on the street. And that is why this series isn't connecting with the hundreds and millions of Tolkien fans all over the world. And it is this muddled view of...
The viewing numbers would disagree. I mean, I can't honestly say that every single one of the millions and millions of people who watch the show are Tolkien fans. There are different levels of Tolkien fandom, but I know that I am not alone. I'm a lifelong Tolkien fan. I can talk the lore with the best of them. I love the show, and I know that I'm not alone because I've met other Tolkien fans who feel the same way. So the claim that it's failing to connect with the Tolkien fandom is a bit bombastic. Okay, sir.
Of good and evil that leads to, I think, a terrible characterization of Galadriel, a cutthroat woman who will stop at nothing to achieve her goal, even sacrificing her fellow elves. But looking at the entire episode as a whole, this...
Okay. I will point out here again, as I have pointed out multiple times on my channel in multiple videos, Paolo, my brother in Christ, that's exactly what you are supposed to think about Galadriel at the beginning of this series. You're not supposed to like her at the beginning of the Rings of Power. The whole point is what you just said about her being obsessive and being obsessed with evil and being blinded by that. That is the point. That is the start of her character arc. You are having exactly the reaction that the writers of this show wanted you to have. And you are so blinded by your preconceived notion you had of the show before ever watching a single frame of it that you have failed to see that that's what the writer's intent was. You are not supposed to like Galadriel at the beginning of the Rings of Power. You're supposed to notice that she is fallen, that she is corrupted by her own obsession. All of this, spoiler alert, literally blows up in her face at the end of season 1. You would know that if you bothered watching more than one episode.
The theme of Galadriel has nothing to do with the other characters. As I said from the start, a good story is cohesive. It's about one thing. The Harfoot adventure centers around Nori, who is longing for adventure. And then you have the elf of color, Arundel, and his theme that seems to revolve around prejudice, a forbidden love between an elf and a woman, and the woman comes from the blood of the people who followed Morgoth. I can't seem to fit the idea of you must touch the darkness in order to know the light in any of these other stories.
That is because you have misidentified "you must touch the darkness to see the light" as the theme of this show, and it objectively is not. I will explain why at the end of this.
And because there is no cohesion, you're left with this question: what the heck is this about? What am I watching? What am I doing here? And you're not compelled to watch any further. So, why doesn't the Rings of Power feel like Tolkien? It lacks cohesion, and the theology is all wrong.
Incorrect.
You get the
Incorrect.
theology wrong, you get the whole world wrong. You get the whole value system of good and evil incorrect. If you're in this gray relative mess, you'll never come up with lines like, "There's good in this world, and it's worth fighting for, Mr. Frodo," right? It's not in the book, but it could have been. Instead of wishing to destroy the orcs, you're debating on the morality of killing orc
Okay,
fathers,
I'm glad we
leaving
came back to
poor
this.
Orc widows and orc orphans at home. We have an elf heaven.
Okay, I am glad Paolo came back to the orc question. I have also addressed this in a previous video. Give me a second. I'm going to go dig up the quote from Morgoth's Ring that Tolkien himself wrote. And just bear with me here. Okay, I'm going to put the quote on screen. I'll make a fancy graphic for it. But remember what Paolo just said about about showing orcs suing for peace and showing us orc families and leading us to have sympathy for orcs being an expression of the Rings of Power's moral ambiguity, right? He's making a theological error here. That objection to the Rings of Power implicitly assumes that there is such a thing as intrinsic evil, that it's implicitly assuming that the orcs are implicit or are intrinsically, it's assuming that the orcs are intrinsically evil. And it's easy to get that impression if all you've read of Tolkien is The Lord of the Rings, because he basically wrote the orcs as cannon fodder in The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. But if you dig deeper into his unpublished works, or his works that were not published while he was alive because he was not done tinkering with them yet, you will find that Tolkien himself became very worried and very concerned with his portrayal of the orcs. And the theological conundrum for Tolkien was this: he had shown the orcs having the power of speech, which meant they were sentient. And if they were sentient beings, they could not be intrinsically evil. They must once have been good. And he tried to resolve this multiple ways in his notes. You can read a lot about it in like his letters, Unfinished Tales, Silmarillion, and so forth. It was a conundrum for him because, according to his own Catholic theology, the orcs, being children of the Iluvatar, as they are, because they reproduce in the same way as the other children of the Iluvatar, he includes orcs in the description children of the Iluvatar. If they were beings created by God, essentially, then they had to be good, at least at their inception. And by portraying them in The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit as essentially cannon fodder, he was undermining his own moral beliefs with that. So in his other works, he explored this question further, and one of those works was Morgoth's Ring. And I'm going to read to you a passage that I've read in other videos, but this might be your first video of mine, so okay. I'm going to read a passage that Tolkien himself wrote in Morgoth's Ring, and then you can decide whether Paolo's implication that there's something morally ambiguous about Rings of Power's depiction of the orcs makes any sense to you. Here we go. Quote, "But even before this wickedness of Morgoth was suspected, the wise in the elder days taught always that the orcs were not made by Melkor, and therefore were not in their origin evil. They might have become irredeemable, at least by elves and men, but they remained within the law. That is, that though of necessity, being the fingers of the hand of Morgoth, they must be fought with utmost severity, they must not be dealt with in their own terms of cruelty and treachery. Captives must not be tormented, not even to discover information for the defense of the homes of elves and men. If any orcs surrendered and asked for mercy, they must be granted it, even at a cost. This was the teaching of the wise, though in the horror of the war it was not always heeded. It is true, of course, that Morgoth held the orcs in dire thraldom," which is to say, this is me speaking, not Tolkien. Being held in dire thraldom is another way of saying the orcs were oppressed. But back to Tolkien. I'll just pick up from the beginning of that sentence. It is true, of course, that Morgoth held the orcs in dire thraldom, for in their corruption, they had lost almost all possibility of resisting the domination of his will. So great indeed did its pressure upon them become ere Angband fell, that if he turned his thought towards them, they were conscious of his eye wherever they might be." Unquote. Now, J.R.R. Tolkien himself wrote those words. If you can read that or hear that quote from Tolkien himself and still believe that what the Rings of Power is doing with its depiction of orcs is in any way inconsistent with Tolkien's moral worldview, then you simply do not understand Tolkien's worldview, his moral worldview, or his theology, anywhere near as well as you are pretending to. So miss me with the orc babies bad, orc families bad, orcs suing for peace bad, and undermining Tolkien. Just miss me with that. It's all bullshit.
Populated with evil elf boys wanting to destroy your toy ships. And instead of women that inspire us with their beauty, bravery, and
This,
femininity.
we're going with
Faced
this?
evil,
Okay.
we're left with a woman who is cutthroat and
Mhm.
unfeeling.
Right,
who
right.
cannot find a way to exist without evil in this world, without a sword in her hand. It is a
And those are all bad things, and you are supposed to think they are bad things. If you believe that it is the intent of the Rings of Power in episode 1 of the show to inspire you, if you think they're intending to have Galadriel be an inspirational girl boss character, you have not understood what the show is doing. And that's because, as we just demonstrated, you fundamentally do not understand the moral worldview of J.R.R. Tolkien and the way that it is baked into the Rings of Power far better than Peter Jackson's films did. Sorry, bro. Looks like we're almost at the end here.
It's a pity, as a lot of genius and resources have been poured into the show, but I will most likely not watch another minute of it. I will instead be watching the summaries of Nerdrotic and the Critical.
Oh,
Oh, thank them for their
there we go.
service.
False prophets,
This
bro.
day, we're touching the dark so that we may continue to bask in the light. Thank you for listening. If you like this kind of content, please like.
All right,
and
I do not like this kind of content. You can go away now. All right. One of the main reasons I decided to react to this video is I suspected it was going to cover what it did cover, which is the claim that the line, "you must touch the darkness in order to see the light," or whatever it was, is intended to be the theme of Galadriel's character arc, and it is not. I never addressed this particular point in any of my previous content, and I should have because it comes up a lot. It is objectively not the theme of Galadriel's story, in season 1 anyway. How do we know it is objectively not the theme? Because it is stated in the wrong place in the script. Maybe those of you who watch this kind of content and like to talk about objective assessments of media that Critical Drinker and all these other buffoons like to criticize, maybe you're not aware that there are some types of objectivity we can talk about here. One of them is that there are particular rules about how to write a script for television and or the movies. One of those rules is where in the script the theme of the story is stated out loud. It doesn't have to be stated out loud, but if it is spoken aloud by a character, it comes in a specific place in the script, and it is never, ever at the end of the episode like this line was. The theme of the script, if it is stated aloud at all, should come in the first act of the story. Film scripts are traditionally broken into 3 acts. Television scripts are generally broken into 5 acts. Rings of Power is a little wonky with that in some ways. But television scripts also have traditionally 5 acts plus a teaser at the beginning. And the reason Rings of Power is a little bit wonky is because it plays around with that a little bit, in that the teaser of episode 1 is like 20 minutes long. It begins with us hearing Galadriel saying, "Nothing is evil in the beginning," and it ends with the killing of the ice troll and her wanting to press on, and the rest of her company saying, "No, we're going back," and so she has to go back with them. That whole segment of episode 1 is the teaser. What comes afterwards is the first act, and this is where we meet Nori, and we meet Elrond, and we meet Everondir, and we meet several of the other main characters, and each of them has a moment where the theme of their story is spoken. But in this act, the theme of Galadriel's story is spoken aloud by Galadriel herself. And I'm going to clip it and play it right now.
Evil does not sleep, Elrond. It waits. And in the moment of our complacency, it blinds us.
That is the theme of Galadriel's story in the Rings of Power. It's not sometimes you have to touch the darkness to see the light. That's objectively not the theme. And if once you understand that the theme of Galadriel's story is that evil waits, and when you're complacent, it strikes, and you watch what happens to Galadriel across the storyline of season 1, that's exactly what happens to her. Spoilers if you haven't seen this, Haldo, but she meets Halbrand, who turns out to be Sauron, and she spends the whole season trying to convince the Númenóreans to give her an army so she can go to the Southlands, which will one day become Mordor, and confront the Orcs because she thinks Sauron is there. But turns out Halbrand is Sauron, and he's basically giving her everything she wants. He's manipulating things to give her everything she wants, and when she gets everything she wants, it literally blows up in her face. Literally. Mount Doom erupts, it blows up in her face, and she has to go back to the elves. She takes Halbrand with her, and when she's back with the elves, she feels at peace. She feels at rest. She feels safe. And that's when Sauron strikes. That's when Sauron begins his plan to create the Rings of Power, arguably comes up with that plan. That is when he reveals himself to her, when she's at her most complacent and she thinks she's gotten everything she wants. Perfectly cohesive, if you ask me. If you had bothered to pay attention to the actual show, and if you actually understood anything at all about Tolkien's theology and moral worldview, you would get this. But instead, you decided to rely on a bunch of pack-leads who are pretending to be smart.
We're smart.
Rather than watching the show and making your own assessment. So, I'm done with you. Go away now. So thanks for watching. If you liked this kind of content, be sure to give me a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel and hit that bell so you will be notified when I upload more videos. And until next time, remember that what's best in life is to crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and engage in discourse with the women.